Imagine a multi-million-pound construction contract that is signed, sealed, and executed. The company's shareholders review the deal and unanimously vote to approve it. By all conventional business logic, this is a binding agreement. The owners agreed to the terms and the capital is ready to move. But when this exact situation went before the highest court in the United Kingdom, the judges looked past the shareholders' vote. They ruled that this universally approved contract didn't exist. Not that it was broken or voidable, but that legally it had never occurred at all. This is the outcome of Ashbury Railway Carriage and Iron Company versus Riche, decided in 1875. The ruling establishes a specific limit in corporate law. Shareholder consent cannot override the legal capacity of the corporation as defined in its Objects Clause. This is the doctrine of ultra vires. To understand why a unanimous business deal gets erased, we have to look at the venue where the erasure happened, the UK House of Lords. We are going to break down the logic the court used to reach this conclusion, applying the standard analytical framework taught in law schools. We trace the court's deduction through 5 steps: the facts, the legal issue, the governing rules, the competing arguments, and finally, the reasoning. This framework strips away the business context and reveals how the law treats a corporation as an artificial entity governed strictly by text. Let's start with the facts. The Ashbury Railway Carriage and Iron Company was incorporated under the British Companies Act of 1862. As the name implies, they were a heavy industrial outfit. Their daily operations involved forging iron and manufacturing physical hardware. The company's foundational document, its Memorandum of Association, stated their purpose precisely. They were legally established to make and sell or lend on hire railway carriages and wagons. The problem began when the company's directors signed a contract with a man named John Riche. Instead of ordering hardware, Ashbury agreed to finance and manage the construction of a railway line in Belgium. With that signature, the directors attempted to move the company from domestic manufacturing into international finance and construction management. The project quickly caused financial strain. Realizing the pivot was legally precarious, the shareholders convened and passed a unanimous resolution to ratify the contract, formalizing their approval. However, the company later abandoned the project anyway, refusing to fulfill their obligations. In response, John Riche sued for a breach of contract. The entire dispute now hinged on a specific question: can a manufacturing entity operate as a financial institution simply because its owners voted to do it? To answer that, the court had to define the governing rules. Everything begins with the Companies Act of 1862. This legislation provided the legal framework for incorporation. Under this act, every new company was required to file a Memorandum of Association. This document had to contain an Objects Clause. This defined the perimeter of the legal personality granted by the state. This boundary is enforced by the doctrine of ultra vires. The doctrine dictates that any act performed by a corporation beyond the scope of its defined objects is null and void. Applying these rules, the House of Lords had to resolve 2 core issues. Did Ashbury have the legal capacity to finance a railway? And if not, could the unanimous shareholder ratification retroactively grant them that capacity? These rules establish that a company's existence is tied entirely to a piece of paper. Unlike a human being, its powers are inherently limited. John Riche approached the issue with commercial logic. He argued for a broad interpretation of Ashbury's memorandum. Because the Objects Clause mentioned railway plant, he claimed this phrasing was expansive enough to cover the construction of a complete railway system. Furthermore, Riche argued that even if the directors overstepped initially, the shareholders, the owners of the capital, had unanimously ratified the agreement. They consented to the risk, meaning the company should be bound by the contract. Ashbury Railway defended itself by relying on a strict textual interpretation. They argued that the memorandum was an unchangeable boundary. Because the Objects Clause did not explicitly authorize the financing of foreign railways, the directors lacked the legal capacity to sign the contract. Therefore, the signature was a dead letter from the moment ink hit the page. We have a clear conflict. On one side, commercial risk-taking and owner consent. On the other, strict statutory compliance. Riche's argument relies on the premise that the shareholders are the supreme power within a company. The court's ruling would have to redefine exactly who actually controls the corporation. The court's reasoning was delivered primarily by Lord Cairns. He began by defining the Memorandum of Association strictly as the charter or the constitution of the company. Cairns reasoned that the Companies Act was a protective measure for shareholders and creditors, rather than a simple tool for business owners to pool capital. It ensured everyone knew exactly what the company was permitted to do. This leads to the concept of the statutory creature. A human is free to do anything not explicitly prohibited. A corporation is the opposite. It can only do what is specifically permitted. Contracts outside this boundary aren't voidable, they are void ab initio. Lord Cairns then addressed the shareholder vote. He drew a sharp line between a company's internal rules, the Articles of Association, and its external capacity, the memorandum. Shareholders can ratify an internal breach. They cannot ratify an ultra-virus act. The shareholders are themselves subjects of the Act of Parliament. If the Act withheld the power to finance a railway from the company, the shareholders have no authority to grant that power themselves. Therefore, even a 100% unanimous vote cannot breathe life into a contract that the company, by law, never had the power to sign. In a single ruling, Lord Cairns permanently subordinated the will of the shareholders to the exact wording of the state statute. The House of Lords ruled in favor of the Ashbury Railway Carriage and Iron Company. The contract with John Riche was declared ultra-virus, rendering it null and void. Because the law viewed the contract as non-existent, Ashbury could not be held liable for breaching it. For John Riche, the application of the law meant he lost a multi-million-pound agreement despite negotiating in good faith and securing shareholder approval. The court prioritized the wording of the statute over the commercial expectations of the individual contractor. This ruling established a strict rule that dominated corporate law for over a century. The court takeaway was clear. A company's objects clause is the final word on its legal powers. This is exactly why modern companies write expansive, catch-all objects clauses, specifically to avoid the trap that caught John Riche. Ashbury versus Riche demonstrates that the corporation is a rigid construct, defined and limited by its founding text, rather than the deals its owners choose to strike.